Hi, this is the video for Monday, March 1st for 12th grade English. So today we're beginning a week on false confessions. We've been looking at confessions for a couple of weeks, and we want to spend a little bit of time considering the question, why would someone confess to something they didn't do? It happens a lot. About 20% of confessions that are taken by police end up being false. So we're going to try to understand what the psychology is of that. And we're going to look at the perspectives of people who have been wrongfully convicted, but also the perspectives of police who are trying to do their job and find out who committed a crime. So that's today and tomorrow, and then Wednesday we'll look at a real crime where we're still waiting for the confession. The first questions we have today are, what is a false confession? Why would someone confess falsely? So just to be clear, there are many times where in an interrogation room, somebody might somebody might confess to a crime that they didn't do. They might have been involved somehow in the crime and end up claiming it was all their responsibility, or they might have no connection to the crime, but confess anyway to having committed the crime. The question in class is, have you ever confessed to something you didn't do? And we're curious about if people have, because there are a lot of reasons to do so, and we're wondering if anybody would have found themselves in that position. For our fictional version, I'm going to take us back to Melissa's confession. Melissa is of Melissa and Asher on our breakup sort of activity. Who is responsible for the breakup? So this was our final document, a pretend email that Melissa sent to Asher. And in it, she writes confession. Hey, Ash, I just wanted to write and say I'm sorry. This was my fault. I take all the responsibility. I don't want you to beat yourself up or anything like that. You didn't do anything wrong. I'll always care about you, Melissa. And when we presented this a few weeks ago, we asked, does this confession change your mind about the crime? Is the confession credible? Do you trust Melissa? When I presented this a couple of weeks ago, people had opinions, and a lot of them said, no, Asher did have some responsibility. He was flirting with Jane. He could have broken it off earlier if he really didn't feel like Melissa understood him. Melissa had parts of this that were her fault, but she shouldn't take the entire responsibility for what is truly a dual thing. But here she is doing that. So why is she doing that? And we talked about a couple of weeks ago how she must be feeling a big sense of guilt, and that this helps her feel better, heal through that guilt by saying it's her fault entirely, even if it's not. She is not an objective witness to this. She's a subjective member of the crime, as it were, and she can't see it clearly. So that brings us to false confessions. What are some other ways that people might not be able to see clearly the crime? And I'm going to take us to an article that we'll read on this video of the New York Times. So it's got that bent, liberal sort of bent usually, and yet it doesn't quite matter in this story. You're just going to see some political statements. And then we will watch a quick trailer, though on this video I can't show it. So if you want to watch it, you'll have to watch it on your own devices if you're watching this at home. And then your STEM today is all about the Central Park 5. So let's learn about the Central Park 5. There's some of this that's a little disturbing, a lot disturbing actually, but nothing I'm going to read to you is graphic in nature. It just alludes to the crime of rape, which can be really hard for people to listen to. And if that's the case, you don't need to listen. I can find another false confession for you. This is a pretty famous case of a false confession, however, and psychology students learn about it in Miss Lawrence's class. It's also becoming more well known now because Netflix put out a series about it. So the documentary in Netflix is called, or it's not a documentary, it's drama. It's called When They See Us. And I mean, if you want to watch it, please feel free. It's a little graphic, it's a lot graphic, and I'd recommend you have full knowledge of what you're getting into. But it's really, really good. It's all about these 5 boys who were convicted of a rape and attempted murder in Central Park. That's why they became known as the Central Park 5. even though it became very clear later that they had falsely confessed. So let's learn about this story. Here's one of the 5. And here he's being escorted into the courthouse for one of the trials. This is a story of the biggest story of its day, a crime that set a high watermark for depravity, an urban atrocity that caused existential hand-wringing for America's biggest city, New York. It was a story that over 30 years changed from solid to liquid to gas, all but vanishing. When They See Us is a 4-part miniseries or series premiering May 31st on Netflix. Directed by Ava DuVernay, it's based on the lives of 5 men who were wrongfully convicted and sent to prison as teenagers for gang raping and nearly killing Trisha Mealy, a woman who was jogging in Central Park in 1989. Their convictions were vacated, which means overturned, in 2002, and the city paid $41 million to settle their civil rights lawsuit. Hated by one generation as brutalizers, they were hailed by the next generation as the brutalized. So, once everybody found out they were innocent, they are now a kind of a standard for how false confessions can wreck people. In the series, these events are fictionalized lightly but not trivially. With a license of imagination, it follows the boys as they turn to men and opens interior spaces, personal torments, family turmoils, prison torture, the sustenance of odd friendships to which daily journalism has little access. Few crimes leave permanent marks on anyone other than the people involved. From its first moments, the Central Park case had been a global cultural phenomenon, its meaning debated and anguished by so many people. A real estate developer not widely known outside of New York in 1989 used it for one of his earliest forays into civic affairs, placing full-page ads to proclaim his fury. You better believe that I hate the people who took this girl and raped her brutally. That developer, Donald J. Trump, said at a standing room only news conference. You'd better believe it. So this is one of the ways that Donald Trump made early headlines when he was a real estate developer, by taking a really public stance in this case against these boys. These boys were terror incarnate, a cause for war for the city. But it was all wrong. Fallibility runs in the human bloodline, and people from many quarters of public life had not done their jobs well, including journalists but me. The attack had not been a gang rape, but almost certainly an assault carried out by a serial criminal acting on his own, while the 5 boys were elsewhere in the park. An investigation by one office concluded in 2002 is a profound distinction. Bungling by the authorities had left the real author of the crime, a truly dangerous predator, on the street for months, as he carried out a binge of raping, maiming, and murdering across the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Miss Mealy was the 2nd woman he raped and beat in the park that week. So there's one cost, right? By accepting the wrongful conviction or the false confession of these 5 boys, the real murderer was still on the loose and killed more people. Locking up these boys for gang rape that had not happened, but most of society believed in, was the same as planting a bomb in their lives that never stopped exploding, and that story is told without blinking in When They See Us. And this journalist is kind of expressing his regret for what he covered and what he failed to say. The New York City psyche, if there is such a thing, no longer dwells in that age of relentless crime. Fear cannot so easily crowd out evidence. The rapid evolution of DNA technology has demonstrated time and time again how the righteous pursuit of truth can become warped. And the works of other filmmakers have shown that the racial tropes of our past were not abandoned, but were poured into the concrete that modern America was built on. Mr. Trump had said, "It's more than anger, it's hatred, and I want society to hate them." For a long time, he got his wish. So here's the story. In the middle of the night, this jogger, who was 28 at the time, had been found near death in a wooded ravine off the road in Central Park. She had been raped, and her skull had been fractured in 2 places. Weeks later, she was able to communicate. She had no memory of what had happened. She suffered severe brain damage. But the 5 boys, ages 14 to 16, had already seemingly provided a narrative to defense. Their names are here. They had been in the park with a makeshift group of 30 other young people, some of them making trouble, hassling a homeless man, forcing bike riders to run a gauntlet, badly hurting a man at the reservoir, while others watched. There's some footage of these boys. Unlike the accurate confessions of these smaller events, their confessions on the assault of the jogger were wrong about where, when, and how it happened. In the series, the police and prosecutors are portrayed as immediately aware of these discrepancies, but that's not true. Chaos does not get its due. The woman who was attacked wasn't identified for nearly a day. Her movements not established till much later. There's a lot more intricacy here than just the police knew what was going on and they wanted to find a criminal. They didn't know what was going on either. Still, it is a fact that in 1989 there was little interest in the weakness of the confessions. This story was big enough, terrible enough to electrify a city grown numb to its own badness. In those years, the daily pulse of New York life included a murder, on average, every 5 hours. Rapes nearly twice as often, and robberies 5 or 6 minutes apart. But the attack in Central Park stood out because the confessions by the 5 teens could have been a chapter of A Clockwork Orange turned to life. It had not been the act of a single deranged individual, but a social and premeditated crime. And that was the most staggering of all. How could apparently well-adjusted youngsters turn into so savage a wolf pack? The New York Times asked. The question reverberates. Of course, they didn't, but the victim was white. The accused were black and brown. If the eldest of that wolf pack were tried, convicted, and hanged, and the 13 and 14-year-olds were stripped, horsewhipped, and sent to prison, the park soon might be safe for women. Note for note, without mention of race, this editorial and others echoed the historic calls for the punishment of dark-skinned men thought to have defiled white women. 2 weeks after the attack, Mr. Trump published his ads headlined, "Bring Back the Death Penalty." So the boys recanted they took back their confessions and said they had been coerced or forced. This, they argued, made those statements inadmissible. Prosecutors replied the parents of 3 of them had been present. How could that be so coercive? But not well understood was that the parents were only sporadically present for interrogations that spread out over a day before the camera was turned on. It was during those unrecorded sessions, unseen by anyone outside the room, that the damning statements were first extracted. In the series, the interrogation scenes are presented as a whirlpool of badgering, menace, and cajoling. They bear a strong resemblance to real life. Not long ago, confessions were seen as trophies of detective work because they are so hard to overcome in a trial. But the DNA era has revealed that false confessions are behind many wrongful convictions, especially with minors. They are most often the invention of cornered minds. So when it's young people who are being questioned, they're so likely to make a false confession. The judge ruled the confessions met the legal requirements for being voluntary. During the trials, there was all sorts of competing demonstrators outside, some claiming the whole thing was a hoax, others really against these boys. Al Sharpton called for a psychiatrist to examine the jogger's amnesia. There was a lot going on that amped up the fever pitch of this trial. I'll keep going a little bit. Ms. Melee came to testify but still had no memory of the crime. And as we move on through the article, I'm going to get to the effects of this false confession. They spent 6 to 13 years in prison. Before parole boards, when a show of unqualified remorse would have given them a better shot at leaving prison earlier, they acknowledged witnessing or participating in another wrongdoing in the park, but refused to concede having done anything to the jogger. They stuck with the story, and so did the system. Years later, the hair match that was said to have matched one of them to the crime was discredited through DNA testing. It happened in 2002 when another criminal, Mateus Reyes, who was a murderer and a serial rapist, serving 33 years to life for other crimes, confessed. He confessed to raping and nearly killing this woman. And then they matched his DNA finally to her crime. After months of investigation, the Manhattan District Attorney concluded that Mr. Reyes knew what he was talking about, and the boys didn't. The confessions were a false mash of error. He moved to vacate the verdicts his office had won, and the whole story dissolved. And so at this point in class, we watched the trailer for this movie, and then I leave you with this STEM to try to make meaning of this, make sense of it all. And that's class.